As the war gets worse and worse for Russia, its panicked and frightened forces are resorting to increasingly desperate measures. They have recently been seen ripping guns off their own tanks. That might sound like one of the most ridiculous moves an army could ever make, and in many ways it is. But it's also a sign of how the war has evolved, and how the Russian side in particular is having to make major changes in order to keep up the fight. Russia has always been one of the world's top tank-producing nations. Even back in the days of the Soviet Union, it invested heavily in tank design and development, churning out one model after another and finding new ways to push the boundaries of how powerful and resilient tanks could be. So, when the war with Ukraine began, Russia had literally thousands of tanks to call on. That included its latest and greatest models like the T-90M, as well as huge amounts of older Soviet-era tanks that had been stored in facilities across the country, ready and waiting for the day that war broke out. And the Kremlin leaned heavily on its armor in the early stages of the war. Numerous reports emerged of huge Russian convoys and tank columns rolling over the borders and into Ukraine, with Russian commanders banking on their brute force tactics to overwhelm any opposition in their way. Unfortunately for them, things didn't quite go to plan. Ukraine defended well, and its soldiers and citizens found inventive and innovative ways to stop Russian armor in its tracks. They were aided by the fact that Russia often misused its tanks, sending them into dangerous areas without sufficient support, for example. As time went by, the number of damaged and destroyed Russian tanks steadily grew. Eventually, it reached a point where Russian troops were forced to dig through old Soviet storage facilities to find decades-old tanks that were still semi-functional to roll out onto the battlefield and replace those that had been destroyed. Tanks dating all the way back to the 1950s were suddenly being deployed, but it didn't help. The losses kept mounting up as Ukraine, like Russia, began to master the art of drone warfare. Ukrainian forces quickly identified the weak points of enemy tanks and found ways to strike them, taking out millions of dollars worth of hardware with drones that cost a fraction of that amount. So Russia made an even bigger tactical decision. It decided to basically stop using tanks altogether in key front-line areas like the Pokrovsk region, where Kremlin forces have been desperately attempting to capture the city of Pokrovsk, an important logistics and transport hub, for many months now. Instead of having to deal with tanks and other heavy armor headed their way, Ukrainian forces found themselves facing off against small squads of troops, often on board simple civilian vehicles or sometimes without any wheels at all, marching on foot in a futile attempt to capture key pieces of land. At this point, one thing was clear: Russia simply could not afford to lose any more tanks. Its reckless and wasteful tactics had gone too far, its economy was suffering, its military was massively weakened, and its opposition was growing stronger, bolstered by support from allies across Europe and the NATO alliance. Russia had to do something to preserve the armor it had left and buy time to produce more tanks and fighting vehicles. So, it adjusted its tactics, throwing men into the meat grinder without tanks to protect them, and relying more heavily on bombs, missiles, and drones to deal significant damage to Ukrainian targets. Now, however, it appears that Russia has come full circle and decided to start using tanks and infantry vehicles once more. It has built up a gigantic force in the Donetsk region, close to the city of Pokrovsk. Some estimates suggest that there are up to 150,000 Russian troops amassing here, backed up by large numbers of tanks and armored vehicles. It's the first time in months a major Russian armored force like this has been seen, and it appears that the Kremlin had been saving up its tanks and other vehicles for this very moment, as it builds up to what might be the last big, bloody battle for the fate of Pokrovsk, a battle that could change the face of the Eastern Front forever. As open-source intelligence analyst Jompy notes, slowly but surely it's being proven that Russia was indeed holding back armor in the rear and reducing mechanized attacks to the bare minimum. Other intelligence analysts have been keeping a close eye on images and videos emerging from the Russian side in order to better understand what types of tanks, exactly, Russia is getting ready to use in the upcoming battle. They've found evidence of many of the usual models like T-90s, T-72s, and T-80 tanks, plus BMP and BTR infantry fighting vehicles. However, analysts have also spotted some very unusual additions to the Kremlin convoy, including tanks that have had their guns and turrets taken off, transforming them into something closer to armored personnel carriers than true tanks. The news was shared by the X account AFV Recognition in a post on September 22. Russian T-72 variant with an improvised armored superstructure. It appears it doesn't have a turret due to the angling of the superstructure and the lack of any main armament protruding out of the superstructure. It also doesn't appear to be a BREM armored recovery vehicle, or IMR armored engineer vehicle, due to the lack of a crane or digger. It's most likely a T-72 converted for transporting assault infantry as close to objectives as possible under cover. This is made possible by what appear to be frequency jamming devices on top of the improvised superstructure and the sheer amount of barbed wire there to pre-detonate FPV drones. I've come to the conclusion that it's a T-72 variant due to the cutout exhaust louver on the left side. Notably, there is also what appears to be a hatch above the exhaust, the mudguard width on the tracks, and the frontal hull shape. It's worth noting that it has 4 S-22 era boxes on the hull sides. The post was accompanied by a video showing the bizarre tank in motion. It's clear to see that this was originally a tank and most likely a T-72 as AFV recognition states, but has had its offensive equipment removed. Its body has also been coated with razor wire and other anti-drone armor like metal spines. Analysts have also spotted anti-missile reactive armor blocks attached to this transformed tank, along with a triangular metal roof equipped with drone jamming radio noisemakers. So, while it may look like a scrap heap that has somehow come to life, this Russian Frankentank actually has quite a lot of innovative armor and technology hidden beneath its ugly surface. But why has Russia felt the need to take a tank that could have been used to deal serious damage to Ukrainian forces and reduce it to a glorified personnel carrier? The answer, in a word, is drones. Drones have come to dominate this war in more ways than one. Russia uses them on a near-daily basis to bombard Ukraine, often deploying hundreds of drones in a single night towards targets all over the country, including the capital city of Kyiv. Its drones regularly kill and wound civilians, as well as damaging buildings and vital pieces of infrastructure, including residential homes, hospitals, schools, and so on. Ukraine, too, has gradually grown more adept at using drones against Russia. Countless incidents have been reported of Ukrainian drones taking out aircraft, radar stations, air defense systems, oil refineries, military factories, and other targets, both in occupied territories and over the border into Russia itself. Ukraine also knows very well how to use drones to take out Russian tanks and armored vehicles, and there have, once again, been numerous cases of kamikaze drones striking the weak points of Russian BMP vehicles or old Soviet tanks, wiping them off the map in a matter of seconds. Russia knows this. It understands that its armor is at major risk at all times and especially along the front lines. At any moment, the distinctive buzzing sound of drones overhead might emerge, and entire convoys can be obliterated by a well-timed and carefully coordinated drone attack. Russia has already lost over 22,000 armored vehicles and other pieces of heavy military equipment, with the majority, around 65%, according to expert estimates, being taken out by drones. The Kremlin cannot afford to keep suffering those sorts of utterly unsustainable losses. At the same time, it also understands that it needs to use its armor if it wants to finally make a genuine, impactful breakthrough in places like Pokrovsk to push on and take the territory it needs. The only answer, therefore, is to find ways to make its armored vehicles much more resilient to drone attacks. Hence, tanks like this one, modified to the point where they're almost unrecognizable, and equipped with all sorts of anti-drone add-ons and technologies. Tanks like this aren't really tanks anymore. They're glorified personnel carriers designed with one thing in mind: survivability. This T-72 isn't going to deal damage on the battlefield. Instead, its duty is clear: keep the troops inside safe for as long as it takes to get to the front lines so they can then roll out and launch an assault. The tank is little more than a shell made to shield those inside against drones, artillery, and missiles. Its bizarre appearance doesn't really matter, as long as it's strong enough and fast enough to do its job. But why couldn't Russia simply rely on its existing infantry fighting vehicles and armored troop carriers to do that job instead? Quite simply because they're not strong enough. Vehicles like the Russian BMP were not made with drone warfare in mind. They are not suitable for this kind of conflict. In a world of kamikaze drones, they are, in effect, obsolete because it only takes one drone to take out an entire BMP in the blink of an eye, likely killing all those inside in the process. Drones can, of course, take out tanks as well, but it's usually a much tougher task. It often requires several drones to take out a single tank, and when looking more closely at how the BMP compares to the T-72, it's easy to understand why. At its thickest point, a BMP infantry fighting vehicle has just 30 millimeters of steel armor. The T-72, meanwhile, has some points with approximately 200 millimeters of composite armor protecting its crew and internal components. As far as armor protection goes, the T-72 is around 7 times tougher than the BMP, and in frontline areas where enemy drone swarms are never too far away, every single millimeter matters. It could be the difference between life and death for those inside, and victory or defeat on the battlefield. Converted tanks like the ones spotted by open-source intelligence analysts are simply stronger and more resilient than any infantry fighting vehicle could ever be. They have a better chance of withstanding direct drone impacts, especially when they're equipped with an array of additional layers of protection, like razor wire, spikes, and so on. Another reason why the Russians may have decided to convert a T-72, in particular, to an IFV is because the T-72 is infamous in the military world for one gigantic design flaw. Designed back in the 1960s, this tank is one of Russia's most popular models, with more than 25,000 units produced in total. It has many strengths, like its V12 diesel engine that allows it to reach peak speeds of close to 50 miles per hour and cover 300 miles of ground on a full tank of fuel. However, it also has one major issue related to its autoloader. On paper, the autoloader may seem like a helpful addition to this tank, as it negates the need for manual loading of the main gun. That means the crew only needs to be made up of 3 people, a commander, gunner, and driver, with no need for a loader. Autoloaders can also provide faster reloads than manual ones, helping the T-72 keep on firing with minimal delay in between shots. Unfortunately, the Soviet designers who created this tank decided to place the tank's ammunition storage right beside the autoloader, just under the tank's turret. That essentially turns T-72s into giant powder kegs, and a well-placed drone or missile strike to the turret can be enough to send the whole tank up in flames. Anyone on board when that happens has almost zero chance of survival, which is why the Russian military has gone to great lengths over the course of the war so far to find ways to make their T-72s tougher. They've added coupe cages around the turrets and welded turtle shell-style armor all over their bodies for extra protection. This new method of removing the tank's gun and turret entirely is just the next evolution of that process, aimed at making the T-72 less likely to be taken out by an accurate drone or rocket attack. Without the turret and gun, the T-72 should also be significantly lighter than before. That, in turn, may help to make it a little more maneuverable on the battlefield or perhaps even able to reach higher speeds than before. It should also counteract the additional weight of the metal spines and reactive armor plates added to the tank's chassis. But despite some positives, this gunless T-72 tank is certainly not without its flaws. Firstly, even without its turret, a T-72 hull weighs around 27 tons, which is still significantly higher than a BMP-3, which tips the scales at just 18 tons. Tanks like this will never be as agile as true infantry fighting vehicles, so even if they can withstand more hits, they'll have a much harder time evading them or fleeing from dangerous combat zones to safer areas. Particularly on tough or uneven terrain, the difference between tanks and infantry fighting vehicles is often clear to see, with the best IFVs and personnel carriers able to handle rough ground or tight corridors with relative ease, while clunky, awkward tanks often get stuck or slow down dramatically. BMPs and similar infantry fighting vehicles are also designed to carry troops and have features that facilitate that process. Many have rear-mounted hatches, for example, that allow troops to get in and out quite quickly and safely. Tanks aren't made the same way, especially Russian tanks, many of which are notoriously awkward and uncomfortable for their crews. Getting in and out of a T-72 is not the easiest task at the best of times, and it becomes even harder when the tank is covered head to toe in spikes and razor wire. Infantry would likely have to climb over the hull and navigate all those points and barbs just to get in or out, which would take time, and in frontline firefights, every single second counts. So, even if the tank itself has stronger survivability than before, the people on board may actually find it much harder to escape with their lives intact, should they need to evacuate for any reason. This isn't to say that tank to IFV conversions don't or can't work. They can. Many military forces around the world have successfully transformed older tanks into personnel carriers. Israel, for example, was converting T-55 tank hulls to APCs back in the 1980s, and Ukraine's forces, too, have found ways to make use of old tanks by stripping off unnecessary parts and turning them into infantry vehicles. It's a system that can prove useful when done well, and Russia's new Franken tanks may indeed be of some use in getting troops to the front lines in one piece. But they're certainly not perfect. They appear awkward, slow, uncomfortable, and even dangerous for those that have to operate them or travel inside them. And even with all their defenses, they're still far from invulnerable. Drones, missiles, bombs, and mines could easily take them out, and Ukraine's forces have proven that they know exactly how to deal with Russian armor, having destroyed over 4,000 tanks so far, along with more than 8,000 armored and infantry fighting vehicles. Arguably, the most important takeaway from all this, however, is that it shows how desperate Russia has become. When the war began, it proudly sent its vast tank and armored vehicle fleets into Ukraine, assured and confident of a swift, crushing victory. Now, more than 3 years later, it has been reduced to dragging decades-old armor out of retirement and even dismantling what should be some of its strongest tanks just to help them survive. And this isn't just a one-off example. There have been many other cases of Russian Frankenstein tanks with everything from chicken coop nets around their turrets to stacks of drone jamming equipment stacked on their chassis. Awkward, slow, clunky, and ridiculous to look at, these crazy creations show just how much the war has changed and how far Russia is having to go to maintain any sort of offensive in Pokrovsk and other frontline locations. With Ukrainian drones getting stronger all the time, even these new defenses may not be enough to prevent more costly losses for the Kremlin. Learn more about Russia's tragic tank situation in our recent breakdown, looking at the real reasons why the Kremlin has been forced to turn its tank tactics upside down to survive. Or for a more up-to-date look at what exactly is going on in Ukraine, check out our video looking at how Ukraine's relentless drone campaign has given Putin a veritable week from hell. Make sure to subscribe to our channel too, so that you can be among the first in the world to find out about the latest big developments from the front lines of Ukraine and news from other important conflicts around the world.